Father who is in heaven. Amen. Praise God.
Well, in Ukraine this week, a 21-year-old Russian soldier went on trial for war crimes. It happened on one of the first days of the war. A 62-year-old Ukrainian named Alexander went outside his house for either a bike ride or a walk. I can't really tell by the reports. He was unarmed. Nearby, a young tank commander named Vadim was driving in a car with the window rolled down. He spotted the 62-year-old man and was ordered to shoot him twice, and he refused. But as the car was closing in on Alexander, Vadim got a third message from his commander: shoot that man. And evidently, fearing God more than his superiors, or fearing his superiors more than God, I should say, he put his AK-47 out the window and pulled the trigger, shooting the 62-year-old man in the head. Well, eventually, Vadim was captured by Ukrainian forces, and this week really became the inaugural of the war crimes of Ukraine. There'll be many more to come, and my guess is this scenario is playing out all over the Ukraine. Russian soldiers are being told to do things they know are not right before God. And some have no problem in complying, and they're committing some awful atrocities, but others, like Vadim, are attempting to take a stand and say no. And whether or not they're successful at being able to stand against their superiors largely depends, I think, on their beliefs. Do they believe that they will first and foremost answer to God before anyone else? Or will they obey the commands of men as opposed to the laws of God? And I think that most of us would hope that we would be the ones to make that courageous stand. But would we? And how do you know when to take a stand, and how do you know when not to? Would fear win out? You know, the story we're going to look at today from the Bible, from Daniel chapter 3, is a very simple one. It's black and white. It's straightforward. It's about three guys who took a stand against a king, a mighty one, and because they did, they got thrown into a fiery furnace. If you have your Bibles, turn to Daniel chapter 3. We're going to go through the whole chapter. And from then, we're going to learn how to make a stand and when to make a stand. How and when. Let's look at verse 1, Daniel chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. To give you some idea of the dimensions here, that statue down outside of Rio de Janeiro, the Christ of the Andes, stands about 90 feet tall. The original lighthouse down at Cape Hatteras also stood about 90 feet as well. And situated on the plain as it would have been a very commanding and very impressive statue. And you remember last week, we were studying Daniel chapter 2, and we saw how Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and Babylon's modern-day Iraq, that's where it is, and Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of a statue made of several precious metals, and Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold at the top. And the whole point of this dream that he had is that as he was the head of gold, and then the next was silver, bronze, and iron, that there was going to be one succession of one kingdom after another. And so the point was, maybe don't get comfortable in this spot, because you're not going to be here for long. You're going to be taken over by another kingdom and another. And that may not have gone over so well. Chapter 3 picks up, so where we're starting here, could be as many as 8 years later, and something significant happened during that time. We learn from an ancient document called the Babylonian Chronicle that there was an attempt on Nebuchadnezzar's life. There was a coup that went on during that period. So it's very possible that what we're reading about here is a response to that coup attempt. And what's happening here is something of a loyalty test for all of the subjects. So the statue had a political and governmental aspect to it. Are you with me? And then what he did is he just layered on a religious component. So what's really going to be happening here is that he's saying, you worship my gods and you're loyal to me, period. And I need to know that everybody in the kingdom, and you're going to find a repetitiveness in this chapter, because the main point here is that everybody, did I say everybody? I mean everybody. That's kind of what the feel that you get as you go through this. Look at verse 2. Then he summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. Yeah, you got the message, everybody. Verse 3. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. And then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be immediately thrown into a blazing furnace. So naturally, the people did what they were supposed to do. Look at verse 7. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of their friends, co-workers, social media, school boards, teachers, entertainers, and politicians, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the idol that was set up by the state. Well, it seems like I may have misread that verse. But maybe not. Maybe not. Because I think there's a possibility that we're hearing the same music today. You think? That coercing us to bow down and accept something that is not acceptable is something that is happening on a pretty regular basis now. We're being told that right is wrong and wrong is right. And we hear the flutes and zithers and horns of the world calling us to submit to the gods of tolerance and immorality and rebellion. And every day we hear those sounds from social media, teachers and entertainers telling us what is acceptable for us to think. And if we don't comply, then we're thrown into the fiery furnace of public scorn. No debate, no reason. It's just bow your knee. And we feel that pressure more and more. And will we say, no, that's not the way it is? Will there be a courageous stand that you make, that you will be called to make? Let's look at verse 8. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews, and they said to the king, may the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all other kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. They're throwing it back in there. They're quoting verbatim. This is what you said, king. This is what you said. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. So you sense there's a bit of jealousy here, don't you? And they may be a bit anti-Semitic as well. I mean, these guys are foreigners coming in. They're getting promoted. They haven't paid their dues like everyone else. And so these guys are a little bit upset that they were promoted to the top posts of the land. It's interesting, isn't it, that Daniel is nowhere to be found in this. We don't know why. It doesn't say in the text why he's not there. People speculate that he was probably sent to another part of the province. He was on business somewhere else. That's probably true. But if that is the case, if Daniel's just not there, and it's most likely that I mean, you can't imagine that if he was there, he wouldn't have been called into account. But what's happening here is that God has taken these three guys, and I'm sure by this time they were leaning pretty heavily on Daniel as their leader. It's like, man, we'll follow this guy to hell and back. And then God says, but I'm going to take him away, and I need to know that you will stand for me too. God often does this to us. When sometimes the person that was discipling us or training us, or the person who was a beloved pastor, or your spiritual leader gets taken away for whatever reason. Maybe they pass away or they move or something happens. And God calls on you to make it real for yourself. So this is not unusual. Well, let's see what happens. Not surprising. Verse 13, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, there's no answer here. It seems like he didn't even give them much of a chance to answer, but he says, now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Now, what's interesting, two things. Number one, the king gives him a second chance. This is not a kind of a guy that normally does this. In fact, we know from Jeremiah 29 that there were two Jewish false prophets, not true Jewish prophets. Two false Jewish prophets stood up and denounced him, and he immediately slow roasted them over a fire. So this is not a guy that you mess with. It's unusual that he gives them a second chance. The other thing that's striking here is his arrogance, isn't it? What God will be able to save you from my hand? He's putting himself in the place of God, is he not? He's saying, no God. And this is a guy that should know better, right? He has seen their God, the God of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do amazing things. He's seen that. And yet he's disbelieving here. So, anyway, we know that God's the ultimate authority. There are times when we need to push back, and these three guys do that very thing. Look at verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. Now, there are times when you don't talk things through. Because if you do, you're likely to compromise. You have no leverage. The person is not open to reason. And so there are times when you just say, I'm not going to really defend myself. This is the way it's going to be. And the attitude here is one of respect. It doesn't sound like this. Your Majesty, we're not going to do that, and we're not going to, we don't need to talk to you. We don't need to defend ourselves. It's not that at all. Because several times they respectfully refer to him by his title. They're just saying no. And there's times when that's the appropriate thing to do. Not to defend, not to argue, not to try to explain, none of that. You just say, I'm sorry, we can't do that. And that's what, in a sense, they're doing here. They could have easily said this to themselves. They could have easily said, you know what? God told us when we came here to serve the Babylonians. That's what we were sent here to do. Jeremiah was very clear about what they were to do when they got there, and that was to serve the people where I'm sending you and work for their prosperity. So they could have said, we're not here to cause trouble. God knows our heart anyway. We know the statue's not really a God. And this is more of a political test than anything else. So they could have easily explained this away. But the three friends knew that Nebuchadnezzar had overstepped his role and that he was asking for ultimate loyalty above everything else. And so they respectfully say, no, we're not going to do that. We're loyal to God's laws. And God says that you shall have no other gods before me. You know, one of my favorite stories comes from the time of the Roman Empire. There were 40 soldiers of Sebast. And they're talked about in hallowed terms. They were part of the 12th Legion of the Roman army. And an edict came down from the emperor that all of the Roman soldiers needed to sacrifice an offering to the emperor and worship him as God. And these 40 soldiers, all of them Christians, came to their commanding officer and said, we can't do that. We're Christians. We worship God and him only. And so the commanding officer threatened them. They said no. And so what they did is they took these 40 guys and stripped them down. And the lake, there was a frozen lake there, and he sent all of them out on the frozen lake and said, when you're ready to renounce Christ, you can come back in. And he set along the shoreline of that lake hot baths and fires and blankets and said, anytime you're ready to denounce Christ, you can enjoy a nice hot bath. And the 40 guys stayed out there until one of them finally couldn't take it anymore. And he came in. And as soon as he came in, one of the other soldiers on shore went out and took his place. So there were still 40 guys. And they all froze to death on that lake. That is taking a stand. That is doing exactly what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. And we're seeing these kind of stands happen all over the world, even right now. In China, many house church leaders are meeting together. The underground church in China is flourishing. Even though the government says, if we find you, and I went to a place in China where like 2 months before I got there, the place was raided and like they were having a conference for house church pastors, and all of them were arrested and taken away. This is happening even now, right under, well, I can't say right under our noses, but during the time in which we live, believers over in places like Saudi Arabia or Iraq, over in these countries where it's basically run under the harsh iron fist of Islam. They're told that you cannot convert to Christianity. If you do, it's under the penalty of death. And there are believers over there that are risking their lives even now to tell their loved ones that if they do not accept Jesus Christ, they will perish. And they're taking a stand for their true king. And all around the world, people are making these same kind of stands. Well, the reaction of the king is very predictable here. Look at verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times harder than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in the army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. And the king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. And this appears to be the end of the story. And many times throughout church history, and in some ways that was the end of the story. The person died. And yet, anytime somebody gives their life for Christ, that's never really the end of the story. In this instant, God directly intervenes. Look at verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, Weren't there 3 men that we tied and threw in the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, Your Majesty." And he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come here," or "come out, come here." And what a total turnaround from being enraged at these guys to saying, "servants of the Most High God." What we're going to see over the next few chapters is God is working on this king. And little by little, he's getting the picture. He's not there yet at this point, but he's recognizing these guys serve the real God. It's almost like the Nebuchadnezzar of chapter 2 is back. And this man in the fiery furnace is no ordinary man, this 4th guy. And the Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan king who has no biblical reference or knows what to say, but he says he calls him like a son of the gods. And there's many reasons to believe that this is actually Jesus Christ with them in the furnace. The Old Testament has several what we call pre-incarnate. So incarnate was when he was incarnated at Christmas. That's what we celebrate. Pre-incarnate, so before he was born on Christmas Day, before he came physically, pre-incarnate revelations, like when he was wrestling Jacob. That was Jesus Christ. When he was talking to Abraham about what he was going to do to Sodom and Gomorrah. And so several other times this happens. And the point we need to see here is that God walks with us wherever we go. When God calls you to do something, like he did Dave Beckwith, when he says, "I want you to run, I want you to go. I don't want you to ask why. I'm not going to tell you how this is going to work out or why I'm doing this. I'm just telling you this is what I want you to do." And hopefully at that point in time, we'll do exactly like what Dave did. We'll say, "Okay, God, you told me to go, and I will." And then God says, "I'm going to go with you. I will go with you. I will never leave you or forsake you, and I will not leave you as orphans." These are the things that God says to us. Whatever God calls us to endure, he has promised to walk with us. The hymn that we're going to sing at the end here, "How Firm a Foundation," helps us understand what God might say to those who endure trials. "Fear not, I am with thee. Oh, be not dismayed, for I am thy God, and will still give thee aid. I'll strengthen thee, help thee, and cause thee to stand, upheld by my gracious, omnipotent hand." I'm with you. I will go with you. And then that second half of verse 26. "So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them." I love that last. They didn't even smell like smoke. How can you go in there and you don't even smell like smoke? And then look at verse 28. Let's read the rest of the chapter here. "Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own." Notice how the king is now testifying on their behalf. Who's doing the witnessing here? The pagan king is doing the witnessing and pointing and saying, these guys testified to their God at the cost of their own lives. Wow. "Therefore," verse 29, "I decree that the people of any nation or language you say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you're going to be cut to pieces and their houses turned into piles of rubble." This guy doesn't do anything halfway. You know, he's either really for you or he's really against you. "For no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Wouldn't you have loved to have seen the look on the faces of those magicians when the king did this? Like, oh man, We just can't come against these guys. And chapter 3 ends like chapter 2 ended, with a pagan king giving praise to God. Now let's think about the takeaways. What can we take away from this? Well, I think there's a couple of things, and this is important, because it's only a matter of time before you face something like this. Maybe not, there's probably the time of you being hauled before a firing squad, maybe a little ways off. But there are times, it could be even this week, where you will be called to either stand up for God or reject him. And what will you do? How do you prepare yourself for that ultimate test of loyalty? Well, here are two principles, and they counterbalance each other. Just two things I would like for us to take away from this passage. One is practice small, and the second is know the big from the small. That's the two application points. Practice small, practice in the small things, taking a stand for God. And then secondly, know the difference between a big issue and a small issue. So first, practice small. You know, by the time that Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego got to this ultimate test, they had passed many smaller tests along the way. They were hauled out of their country, taken to a foreign land. They had the test of their diet and being told to eat things they were not allowed to eat in chapter 1. You remember that? And then the test of being able to interpret the dream, and they faithfully went along with Daniel, and they helped him interpret the dream and praying with him. So God had been step by step preparing these guys for this moment. God had been developing their faith. Friends, God is developing your faith as well. They learned how to take a courageous, obedient stand for God in the small things, and so when the big time came, they were ready. Lori Taylor and I were talking about this week. She had mentioned a quote from Oswald Chambers that I thought was really fitting here. He says this: "We presume that we would be ready for battle if confronted with a great crisis. But it is not the crisis that builds something within us. It simply reveals what we are made of already. Do you find yourself saying, if God calls me to battle, of course, I will rise to the occasion, yet you won't rise to the occasion unless you have done so on God's training ground. If you're not doing the task that is closest to you now, which God has engineered into your life, when the crisis comes, instead of being fit for battle, you will be revealed as being unfit. Crisis always reveals a person's true character." That is so true, so true. I love the way he says it here. Chances are there is an opportunity for you to stand up for Christ right now that is closest to you, in your school, in your place of work, in your neighborhood. You say, I'll take a bullet for Jesus. Are you talking to Mrs. Smith, the 80-year-old lady right next door to you? No, she kind of freaks me out. Then don't tell me you're going to be able to stand in front of a firing squad. If you can't face Mrs. Smith, you're not going to be able to face the firing squad. Does that make sense? You've got to be able to be faithful to him. And it's like he says, God has engineered these things into your life. I love the way he said, God has orchestrated these things. Right now, friends, this is so true. In your life, God has orchestrated, he has maneuvered opportunities for you right now to learn how to take a stand. He is preparing you because, friends, the persecution is coming. It is coming. You can see it as clear as day. And if we don't pass the Mrs. Smith test, we won't be ready when that larger test comes. What are you talking about? Well, are you ashamed to just let people know that you're a Christian? What did you do on Sunday? Oh, I don't know, I just kind of stayed around. You're afraid to tell them you went to church. You bring your meals. Some of you young people, you go into the cafeteria. Do you pray before your meal? Well, it would look really awkward, whatever. Really? Are you ashamed to pray? I mean, don't tell me you're going to pass a big test if you won't even pray in the cafeteria or in the restaurant. You know, for those of us who are older, oh, I don't want to do that. You know, I'm not asking you to lead the restaurant in a worship song. We're just saying quietly pray, okay? That's all we're saying. Can you do that? Can you pray before your meal. Bow your head and pray. I remember this happened one time when I was young. Me and my buddies, we went out to pray. We were like, I don't know, we must have been college students or something. So we're bowing our heads, and the waitress came up, and she didn't know we were praying. She goes, "Is something wrong with the food?" And my buddy goes, "We're praying!" You know, well, he could have been a little more tactful on that. I think we missed an opportunity there. But let's put it in perspective. Right now, over in Iraq, there are Christians with ISIS right around the corner that are putting crosses around their rearview mirror in their car. There is one family that is 14 kilometers away from an ISIS stronghold that's painted a mural of Jesus Christ on their house. Many people are putting crosses on top of their house. And what do you have to lose by being not ashamed of Christ? Man. Well, the second thing is to know the big from the small. You know, we see in Daniel chapter 1 how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, along with Daniel, took a much different approach. You remember back then in chapter 1, he was talking about food, and they could have easily said, "We're not going to eat your food." But what they did is they took a softer approach. They reasoned with the guy, Ashpenaz, I think is the guy's name, who was the guy in charge of the captives. And they said, "Hey, let's do a test." And so they took a whole different approach. In other words, you know the big things from the small things. These guys could tell a big issue on this. I'm sorry, no debate, no discussion. The answer is just no. We're not even going to defend ourselves, as opposed to an issue where, okay, let's talk about this. And I believe that one of the signs of maturity of a Christian is you know what hills to die on and what hills not to die on. Sometimes we Christians, we have this innate desire. We want to take a stand. We know that God is calling us to take a stand. And so what we do, instead of taking a stand against the world, we take stand against other Christians. It's like, wait a minute. Is that what God is calling you to do? To take a stand against another Christian? Now, if it's a case of immorality or if it's a case of heresy, yes, okay, you probably do. But we're fighting about things like the style of music or the translation of the English Bible that we use, or how much God is in control and how much man is free, or the gift of tongues, or the use of alcohol, or the end times. And people are taking such strong stands on these things, but it gets worse, friends. I even went on the internet and I looked up, I forget what I Googled, like stupid things Christians fight over, or things, 25 idiotic things that Christians leave churches for. Here's some of the things. What kind of communion bread to have? Should it be gluten-free, unleavened bread or Hawaiian sweet bread? You can't have Hawaiian sweet. That's where we draw the line. Hawaiian. Really, you're going to leave the church over that? One church had a conflict because some poor soul couldn't find grape juice, so they used cran grape. And people freaked out about it. You can't have cran grape. That's not allowed, and they're ready to leave the church over cran grape. What kind of coffee to serve? Starbucks or Folgers? You can't have deviled eggs in the Christian church, I'm sorry. People, this is serious. Some people, so Carol Abel, where's Carol? She's back in the back. Can't bring your devil eggs. You could change the name to angel eggs or whatever. Access to the copy machine. Virtually any kind of decoration. You try to decorate any kind of decoration, people will fight over that. Or building anything. You try to build something in a church, and people will have different ideas on how it should be built, when it should be built, the way, and we'll fight over that. And now we can add to the list the coronavirus, whether to wear masks, whether to get vaccines. Why are we doing that? Why are we fighting it? We are not called to take a stand against each other. You got your gun pointed in the wrong direction. You got your gun pointed at your brother or sister in Christ instead of pointing it at the devil. A theologian named Rupertus Melodinus wrote a Christian tract back in the 30 Years' War, which was this bloody battle over in Europe. I think in the 17th century, people were fighting about religious things. For 30 years, 8 million people died. And finally, this guy wrote this tract, and he ended it with this: unity in the essentials, liberty in non-essentials, and love in all things. Augustine was attributed that, but I believe it was this fellow Melodinus. And that's very well said. That should be our phrase as well. Or we can just say, look, we're going to major on the majors. And so when we can't agree on something small, we choose to just not make it a big deal. Most of the things that we get ornery about have to do with our own pride, or just somebody offended us. They have nothing to do with the cause of Christ. And Proverbs 17:9 says this: whoever should foster love covers over an offense, but whoever repeats the matter separates close friends. In other words, do you keep repeating? You keep telling how somebody hurt your feelings or did something that made you mad, made you upset? Or do you cover it over and you say, look, it was no big deal, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. We choose to overlook it. So practice taking a stand in the small things and know the big things from the small. That's what we can learn from these guys who took a stand. And they knew when to take it, they knew how to take it, and so they glorified God, and we're still telling their stories today. Now, I mentioned the song, How Firm a Foundation, earlier, and this is what we're going to end. We're going to end with this song, and I want to read to you a couple of verses. I believe the writer had Daniel 3 in mind when he wrote this verse. When through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, my grace all sufficient shall be thy supply. The flame shall not harm thee, I only design thy dross to consume, thy gold to refine. You know what dross is? When you're purifying gold and you heat it up and you make it real hot, then all that scum comes to the top. All the impurities of the gold come to the top, and they skim that off the top. They skim it off the top, so it's just pure. That's what God wants to do. Through the heating up of trials in your life, he wants to skim off all of the bad attitudes, all of the unchristlike things in you. And then this verse is not in many of the hymnals, but I think that it's worth hearing as well. When through the deep waters I call thee to go, the rivers of sorrow shall not overflow. For I will be with thee, thy trouble to bless, and sanctify to thee thy deepest distress. You feel like you're going through some deep waters right now? God's with you. He's walking with you. Let's stand right now, and let's end by singing How Firm a Foundation.